Thanks, Laura. Thanks, everyone. Actually, it's nice to be back, and I think we were trying to figure out when was the last time I was here, and I think it's like 4+ years ago when I did a presentation. But it is nice to be back. It's nice to be back in person. And as Laura said, my name is David Fantle, and I'm an adjunct professor at Marquette. I've been teaching part-time at Marquette for about 12 years now. I've taught courses in television history, the Hollywood musical. Most recently, for several years, I've been teaching an American film history course, a film class called Film and Pop Culture. But for 36 years of my full-time career life, 30+ being here in Milwaukee, I've been in the public relations and marketing world because my love for classic movies doesn't pay the bills, it doesn't raise 3 kids, it doesn't support a family. So I had to have a day job for 36 years. And for 7 years I was vice president at Visit Milwaukee, the Convention and Visitors Bureau. 13 years I did public relations for Wisconsin Gas Company. For 4 years I was the deputy tourism secretary for the state of Wisconsin. So I've had fun, I've had varied things, but my vocation for more than 40 years has been what I would call the golden age of Hollywood. And there's people and films and names that are going to be very familiar to you in the next 45 minutes or so. So let's get started. What you see on the screen is a book that I co-authored, and this came out in 2018. It's called Hollywood Heyday, 75 Candid Interviews with Golden Age Legends. And it's 75 of about 250 interviews that I've conducted over the past 42 years. And when I say it's we, I actually have a partner in crime, and you'll learn a little bit more about him during the presentation. His name is Tom Johnson, and Tom and I grew up together in St. Paul, Minnesota, and became film buffs, and became interested in the same time. You'll hear this whole story. Tom, for the last 20+ years, has lived as a freelance writer in Los Angeles, and we continue to collaborate over 40 years later. In fact, Tom is coming to Milwaukee for the first time in 25 years on Saturday because we're working on our 3rd film book, and we just have to really intensely work on this thing for the next week together versus working 2,000 miles apart. So you'll learn a little bit more about Tom. Now, the foreword to Hollywood Heyday was written by Robert Wagner. And Robert Wagner, or RJ, is an actor. He's still with us. I believe he just turned 91, 92 years old. A wonderful guy who grew up to know many of these Golden Age stars himself. But I thought one way to introduce myself is to play about a 3.5 minute clip of me on Fox in Chicago. This was 3 summers ago, June of 2018, when the book first came out. I'm being interviewed on the Fox station. It gives you a little insight to what I've been up to for the last 40+ years. So let me run that first.
Almost 40 years ago to this day, 2 Twin City teens took their passion of classic
You should see a picture.
They flew to LA to interview Hollywood legends Fred Astaire and Gene Kelly. More than 200 interviews followed, and
it worked when we tried it. Hold on.
No picture.
almost 40 years ago to this day, 2 Twin City teens took their passion of classic film to the unthinkable. They flew to LA to interview Hollywood legends Fred Astaire and Gene Kelly. More than 200 interviews followed, and now their interviews and rare photos are captured in the new book, Hollywood Heyday, 75 Candid Interviews with Golden Age Legends. Here today to share some of those stories, David Fantle. David, good to see you, sir. I was just telling you, I've done junkets for about 10 years. I've interviewed a lot of celebrities. I don't often meet people who have a more impressive list than I do. I bow to the people that you've interviewed, sir. I want to talk about that first interview.
Yeah.
Journalists have worked the entire years and not gotten 2 names, that Fred Astaire and Gene Kelly. How did that first interview work out?
Well, in 1974, a friend of mine, Tom Johnson, who we were growing up in the Twin Cities,
Yeah.
we saw the film That's Entertainment.
Okay.
We became film geeks. So then, in the mid-70s, close to when we were graduating high school, we had this preposterous idea that these golden age legends like Astaire and Kelly were in their golden years, but
Right.
very much with us. So we did the unspeakable. We sent them a letter in snail mail with a
Unbelievable.
self-addressed stamped envelope, and they green-lit interviews. So at age 18, 40 years ago, to this month, in June of 1978, we hopped on a plane from Minneapolis to have these transformational interviews with the screen legends Astaire and Kelly. And of course, because they were so universally revered, they opened up the door for us to meet all of these other legends that are in the book Hollywood Hated.
And you know how celebrity interviews work these days. It's changed a little bit. No more writing letters to the Tom Cruises of the world. It's like, hey, let's sit down and chat. I was wondering if you'd give me just a quick rattle off of some of the biggest things you've interviewed, and tell me the person that maybe surprised you the most because maybe they were most different from who you thought they were going to be.
Well, Lucille Ball, of course, iconic.
Wow.
Dead serious, no humor.
Really?
Yeah, and we have to remember, she was the first woman mogul. She really broke the glass ceiling. So she did her work on I Love Lucy, but behind the scenes, she was all business.
I'm curious, I found with comedians, maybe short of Robert Williams was an exception, a lot of comedians are so much more serious in person because, they can't be on all the time.
Well,
you find that?
Yes, and same thing with Bob Hope.
Wow.
He was incredibly frank with us because he wasn't known to really have any interviews of substance.
Right.
But then again, you interview a Milton Berle, and he's telling, jokes that we cannot repeat on television.
We'll talk about that off camera.
And George Burns, who was always on. Wonderful people. But the other one is James Cagney. I mean, James Cagney, known for all of those gangster films. We had a very rare opportunity to be in his home in Los Angeles, and he called them hoodlum films.
He didn't like them?
No, he hated them.
What?
Yeah, the only thing he said he cared about or would even watch if they were on TV were the handful of musicals he made, of course, Yankee Doodle Dandy.
Wow. Did you have sort of a great white whale, someone that you didn't get that like you would have just killed for?
Well, we love Johnny Carson.
Yeah.
Who didn't?
Yeah.
He was so iconic.
Yeah.
We were fortunate enough to get to his producer and get to know him quite well, Fred de Cordova and Ed McMahon. We were in his green room, in his dressing room before the Tonight Show. They're both in the book, but we never could get to Johnny. And who would want to get to someone like John Wayne?
Yeah, for sure. Well, to be fair, you may not have gotten Carson, but you maybe have gotten more people than Carson. Really quick, tell people where they can get the book.
Of course, they can go to Amazon, BarnesandNoble.com, the usual suspects in order the book.
I was just telling you, you're the sort of person I would love to just take to a bar and I'll buy your drinks all night. You'll just tell me stories from the book.
We have a date
Is that the
tonight.
deal?
We have a date
Fantastic. My fiance might disagree, but I'll schedule. Yeah, we'll reschedule. David, again, thank you so much. Love chatting with you, man. Thank you so much.
So that's a little summation. So who remembers That's Entertainment? Because I talked about it in that TV interview. So I was growing up in St. Paul. I was in middle school. And my parents took me to a downtown theater. They used to have theaters downtown, if you remember. And I saw That's Entertainment. And it was the first time that I was exposed to these golden age stars. And if you remember, the slogan you see on the poster for that film was, "Boy, do we need it now." And if you remember those MGM musicals, which were celebrated in That's Entertainment, in fact, That's Entertainment came out to commemorate the 50th anniversary of Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer Studios, MGM Studios. But the plots of so many of those musicals were so basic and simple and innocent. It was boy meets girl, boy loses girl, boy sings a song and gets girl. I mean, that was pretty much the plot of so many of those films. But boy, do we need it now. You remember mid-70s, it was Watergate, the end of the Vietnam War. We had a lot of stuff going on. And these musicals represented what? Entertainment and escapism. Well, I look at that slogan, "Boy, do we need it now," and I look at the year 2021 that we're in the last year, and I could say again, boy, do we need it now. I mean, it still works today. So my friend Tom Johnson, who also went to middle school, had a similar experience, and we had this shared experience, and this was the first film that really introduced us to these screen legends. And you see 3 examples on the screen. It was Fred Astaire dancing on the walls in the ceiling from the movie Royal Wedding. The iconic pose on the lamppost of Gene Kelly from Singin' in the Rain in 1952. And Judy Garland doing her final number after 16 years at MGM, a number called Get Happy from a film called Summer Stock in 1950. But those were 3 examples of the legendary people we saw for the first time in That's Entertainment. Now, I want to show this clip. This was also, part of this clip was in That's Entertainment. But I think it's a good example. It's what I call a showstopper, and I got a couple clips throughout this presentation that I love to pause and share with you. And this is a clip of the only time the two greatest male dancers in the history of movies worked together. And when I say worked together, during the Hollywood heyday. Yes, they worked together in something called That's Entertainment 2 in 1976, but that doesn't quite count. This was 1946. And this was a film called Ziegfeld Follies. It was one of these lavish MGM review films. And again, it was the only chance that Astaire and Kelly, the two great dancers, worked together in this film. And here's a short segment of their routine called The Babbitt and the Bromide, and it's a tune written by George Gershwin.
Hello, how are you? How's the folks? What's new? I'm great. That's good. Ha ha, not good. Well, well, that's right. What do you know? How's the wife? Gotta run. Oh my. Ta-ta. Hello, goodbye.
Before they met again some 20 years, they had to wait. This time it happened up above inside St. Peter's Gate. A harpies one was carrying and both were sprouting wings. And this is what they said as they were strumming on the strings.
Hello, how are you? How's the folks? What's new? I'm great. That's good. Ha ha, not good. Well, well, that's right. What do you know? How's the wife? Gotta fly. Oh my. Ta-ta. Hello. Goodbye.
So in That's Entertainment, Frank Sinatra was one of the narrators, and he narrated a sequence with Fred Astaire and Eleanor Powell dancing to Cole Porter's Begin the Beguine. And he said, you know, you can wait around and hope, but you'll never see the likes of this again. And I think when you see clips like that, there's no one that can replicate the artistic genius of people like Fred Astaire and Gene Kelly. So here we are now, we're back into the mid-70s, we had just seen That's Entertainment, and this was before Turner Classic Movies, this was before DVRs and DVDs and even VHSs. So really, there weren't a lot of ways to see these films in their entirety. And I remember most cities had like the late show where they would show old movies at 12 or 1 in the morning. But there was one way that Tom and I figured out how to see these films in their entirety. And that was, if you remember the old Bell & Howell 16mm projectors. And that's one of them, that's Tom and I back there in the 70s with the Bell & Howell projector. And we would actually rent the 16mm films in their entirety, and then we would take them, we would pay for them, and then take them to Minneapolis, St. Paul area retirement facilities, very much like this. And we would show these films in their entirety. The good news was we became film buffs because we were seeing all these films. The bad news is we sometimes had to watch the same film 4, 5, or 6 times. And they weren't all good, let's face it. Some of them had, weren't great. But anyways, we called this Films on Wheels because we were driving around, we were 16 at the time, and driving around the Twin Cities with the Films on Wheels. We actually had a few articles written about Films on Wheels, and then we graduated high school in 1978 in St. Paul, and before we graduated, we thought, you know, we've been seeing all these films, do you think there's any chance that we could write letters to Fred Astaire and Gene Kelly and they would actually see us? And I mentioned in the interview, many of the stars from the golden age were in their golden years, but they were still very much with us back in 1978. So we sent these letters and the articles and a self-addressed stamped envelope to their home addresses in Los Angeles or Beverly Hills. And here's the example, they actually responded. And what you see on the center of the screen is the actual letter that Gene Kelly sent me to my home in St. Paul on April 9th, 1978. And he said, hey, if she'll arrange a time for us to get together for a short visit. And so this was the start. And there's a picture, that's Gene Kelly's home in Beverly Hills. It's still there. I don't think its shutters are red anymore. But it was a home that he moved into in 1947. He bought it in 1947. And he was married at the time to the actress named Betsy Blair. And that was the house he was in until he passed away. And we had a similar letter to see Fred Astaire. Now, Fred Astaire was nice enough, he consented to a photo. Now, people always think Hollywood and movies are sort of a myth because the image of people like Fred Astaire is one of being really tall. Well, you can see I'm not exactly an NBA player. And I'm maybe 5'10" on a good day. And I'm taller than Fred Astaire. So Fred Astaire was 5'9". He was 78 years old at the time of this photo. And Gene Kelly was only 5'7". So of course, as you can imagine, that presented some problems when you're dancing with people like Sid Charisse or Rita Hayworth, who were pretty tall. They had to wear flats. They couldn't have high heels in order for their male dancers, to partners, to be taller than them. But as you can see, I was 18 years old at the time of this photo, and I have not changed a bit. And it was the opportunity, it was the first suit that I ever purchased, was for this trip to Los Angeles, because we always, with few exceptions during our college years and our trips to Los Angeles, always afforded these people what we thought was the respect that they deserved. And so we always came with suits and ties on, like I said, with few exceptions. Now this photo with Astaire was like the Willy Wonka golden ticket. Because when you start with Astaire and Kelly, who are so universally revered, it opened up all the doors for us. And in fact, Hollywood Heyday, the book that came out in 2018, is simply dedicated to Fred Astaire and Gene Kelly, because I would not be here today doing what I'm doing or talking if it wasn't for their generosity. So, California, here we come. We went there in 1978, and in the course of the last 40-some years, we've interviewed close to 250 celebrities. Now, during our college years, 1978 to 1983, we probably interviewed about 70 or 80. That was done through trips that went from anywhere from 1 week to Los Angeles to 3 weeks to Los Angeles. Then in the 1990s, we continued to pick up as many as we could of these stars that were still with us. And then at the end, I'll show you a few of the last remaining stars from that era that we really picked up interviews with within the last maybe even 10 years. These are some photos that I took, just 6 examples. And on the top left, it is someone who's still with us. She's living in London, England, and that's Leslie Caron, who made her film debut with Gene Kelly in An American in Paris, which won the Best Picture Academy Award. And then in 1958, she starred in another film that won the Best Picture Academy Award called Gigi. It was also the end of the great MGM musicals in 1958 with Gigi. In the center, you have another Oscar-winning actor, really interesting interview, and in other talks, I talk more at length about some of these other stars. But the man in the middle, in the bathrobe on the top, is Rod Steiger, who won an Academy Award for a film called In the Heat of the Night. On the top right is someone that I talk about more in my musical presentation, that's Debbie Reynolds. Lower left is none other than Moses himself, Charlton Heston, or Ben-Hur, you can take your pick. And we had 2 visits with Charlton Heston at his home over about a 15-year period. And the woman in red is a name that you probably all know. You don't probably recognize her because that was taken in the 90s, not during her heyday. She was MGM's reigning soprano, and her name was Katherine Grayson. And she partnered, if you remember, with Howard Keel in Kiss Me Kate. In Showboat, she partnered with Mario Lanza, The Toast of New Orleans, and films like that. And then, of course, Fred Astaire. Now, I'm going to sort of go down memory lane and just show some photos that I've taken and a few stories to give you a little flavor for some of the people that aren't really covered in some of my other presentations. Excuse me. Now, the reason I start with this gentleman, does anyone know who this is? I'll give it away in a second. The reason I have this photo to start with is, I guess, like I said, this was never a vocation for me. This was always a hobby for me. And one of the benefits of our interest in doing this is that since 2005, I've been fortunate to go and do these talks on cruise ships. And so I always start this by showing Captain Stupid from the Love Boat, because this was taken in 1979. He was shooting the Love Boat on the 20th Century Fox set, and his name is Gavin McLeod. Now, Gavin was a really nice, wonderful guy, and we just lost him like a month or 2 ago, and he was 90. And, of course, he was a character actor in movies and in TV shows. He played comedy, he played heavies, movies like Operation Petticoat. He was one of the crew members, remember the Ernie Borgnine series, McHale's Navy? He was one of the crew members of PT-73. But he really became part of our lives and into our homes when for 7 years he starred in the Mary Tyler Moore Show with that incredible cast. Ed Asner, I'll talk about Ed in a few minutes. Ted Knight, we had lunch with Ted Knight, who played Ted Baxter. Just a wonderful, wonderful people, all of them associated with that show that we met. And then, of course, after he did The Love Boat, which ran for many, many years, and really that show was what popularized this whole cruise ship industry. Of course, I have not been on a cruise ship for over a year and a half, and my wife and I will probably dip our toes into the water if all goes well in the fall, so we'll see how that goes. Now I'm going to start with, this one's a real tough one. I have 2 people here who were behind the camera, and this one's an Academy Award-winning director, and if you look at his eyes, you might be able to see his famous daughter, the resemblance. And his famous daughter was Liza Minnelli. And he's Vincent Minnelli, who was married to Judy Garland, and they had 1 child together, Liza Minnelli. There they are in the photo. And it's interesting, I'll talk a little bit about how incestuous Hollywood is in a couple minutes. But Vincent Minnelli is really one of the great unheralded directors of the Golden Age, especially the Golden Age of these Hollywood musicals. Born in Chicago to a performing family. He made his way to New York City, where he started doing set decoration and work at Radio City, and then started directing Broadway musicals. And then Hollywood came calling. Not an unusual path. Gene Kelly starred in Pal Joey on Broadway. Hollywood came calling. Fred Astaire and his sister Adele started on Broadway. Hollywood. Bob Hope, Broadway to Hollywood. Very common path for many of these stars. But he's known for his lush colors in his musicals. And Meet Me in St. Louis was his film that he made. At the time, he was not married. That was when he first worked with Judy Garland. They weren't married at the time. Then An American in Paris that won an Academy Award. A great musical with Fred Astaire and Sid Charisse called The Bandwagon. Then Gigi, where he won his Academy Award. But when I say he's a great director and a great studio director, he was a company man. He worked for MGM for about 25 years. He did whatever the assignments were, whether they were musicals or non-musicals. And a few examples are, he directed Father of the Bride with Spencer Tracy and Elizabeth Taylor. Hugely successful film. The Bad and the Beautiful, one of the great Hollywood melodramas with Kirk Douglas and Lana Turner. And then he did the biopic with Kirk Douglas, beautiful color, on the Vincent van Gogh story called Lust for Life. So that was Vincent Minnelli. This gentleman, I don't know if anyone recognizes this photo, but this photo was taken in his backyard in the Los Angeles area, where he actually was, in real life, a conservationist and an organic farmer, and grew his own vegetables, fruits and vegetables. And that is Eddie Albert. And there's Eddie, a photo I took with him. And Eddie Albert was born in 1906 and grew up in the Midwest. He was born in Illinois, raised in the Twin Cities area, and actually did a lot of work, was a veteran of World War II. And he started in movies in 1939. He was starring in a movie called Brother Rat, which also starred a gentleman who became the President of the United States, Ronald Reagan. But he received an Academy Award nomination for Roman Holiday, the film with Gregory Peck and Audrey Hepburn, Oklahoma, The Longest Day, another Oscar nomination for The Heartbreak Kid. He was in the original film, The Longest Yard, but then he became known in the 1960s for a show that ran 5 or 6 years on CBS called Green Acres, that sort of goofy show with Ava Gabor. There's Eddie in the middle with the cast of Green Acres. And then later on, he starred in a private eye show on CBS with Robert Wagner, and it was a television show called Switch. Anyone recognize this pensive gentleman?
Steve.
Yeah, very good. So this is Steve Allen. We did 2 interviews with him. We talked comedy, we talked music, both things that he had a great interest in. That was taken in his Los Angeles office. So Steve Allen from Chicago. What's Steve Allen's greatest claim to fame? He was the first host of The Tonight Show, and he started the franchise. Many of the things that he did on the original Tonight Show, gimmicks and Man on the Street and sketches and things like that, have been for decades copied by some of these other late night hosts as well. But he was also an accomplished composer, piano player, musician. Now, he wrote a lot of songs. I can't say he had a lot of hit songs. Now, his most famous song was a Steve Lawrence Edie Gourmet, and it was called "This Could Be the Start of Something Big." His name, that was his biggest hit. But he also made a movie called The Benny Goodman Story, in which he played the King of Swing, another guy from Chicago, Benny Goodman. And the photo is Steve on the clarinet. Now, he wasn't really a clarinet player. He was a pianist. And that's Benny's daughter. And in the middle, in the dark dress next to Benny, was the co-star, another Oscar-winning actress, Donna Reed, who also went on to have a very popular TV show. But Steve told us, and I don't know if it's been printed, but during the interview he said that the role of Benny Goodman came down between him and Tony Curtis. And they ended up casting Steve Allen, and Steve said he probably did it for 2 reasons. One is, Tony Curtis in real life was not a musician, so he would have to totally fake it, whereas at least Steve was a musician. The second thing is, he said that Tony Curtis, let's face it, was a pretty boy actor. He was an handsome actor. Well, Benny Goodman doesn't really fit the Cary Grant, Tony Curtis mold as much as Steve Allen. So they said when they put all that together, even though Steve didn't really have film experience, they gave the role to Steve versus Tony Curtis. I mentioned him. He's still with us. He's still grumpy. But this was taken at the CBS studios in Los Angeles when he was doing the show immediately that he did after Mary Tyler Moore, and that was the title character of Lou Grant. And of course, the character of Lou Grant from the Mary Tyler Moore show that started as a comedy and then became more of a serious show. Ed Asner is one of the most awarded Emmy winners for one character. I think he has won more Emmys for that role than almost any other actor. The other one that could compete was a gentleman, actor named Don Knotts, who seemed to win a lot of them for playing Barney Fife on the... Poor Andy Griffith never won a thing. But Don Knotts as Barney Fife, I think, picked up 4 or 5 Emmys for his role as Barney Fife. But anyways, Ed Asner, this was actually only 3 years ago here in Milwaukee when the book came out, and Ed Asner was here. He had hurt his foot, so he was in a wheelchair, but he was doing a dramatic reading of a play in Milwaukee, and he was in the book, so it was sort of an opportunity for me to give him a copy and to reminisce. Of course, he was nice enough to pretend like he remembered me, but of course, I couldn't hold, that was 40 years earlier. But Ed starred in those great shows, iconic character of Lou Grant. The younger audiences today remember him for a Christmas movie called Elf, where with Will Ferrell. And he's still active, and he's, I think, 91, 92 years old. This one is real difficult. This was taken in Minneapolis. And this gentleman was actually born in Sicily and came to the United States at a very young age. And he became the most decorated, most famous director of the 1930s. And his name is Frank Capra. And Frank Capra, we did 2 interviews with Capra during college. One was near his home in La Quinta, California. And the second one was when he came to Minneapolis for a film festival. And we spent the better part of a half a day with Capra. But Frank Capra started in silent movies as a gag man, and then he came to Columbia Pictures and basically rescued Columbia Pictures from bankruptcy with a film in 1933 called It Happened One Night. And It Happened One Night was the first film ever to win Best Picture, Best Actor, Clark Gable, Best Actress, Claudette Colbert, Best Screenplay, and Best Director in Frank Capra. It picked up all the major awards, the first one to ever do that. And then he worked with people like Gary Cooper in Mr. Deeds Goes to Town and Meet John Doe. And then he worked with Jimmy Stewart in great films like Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. And another film that young people seem to remember, and that's because it's shown every year on NBC around Christmas time, and that's It's a Wonderful Life. Frank Capra was called the Mark Twain of filmmakers. Because if you look at films like Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, Mr. Deeds Goes to Town, it's about Depression era, it's about the little guy overcoming the power system, the elite. And so he was called this, his films have been called Capricorn, because they're a little corny, very Americana, you could say. But the fun thing, or the thing that Tom and I talk about to this day and always remember is, here's 2 college kids that took the Mark Twain of filmmakers at age 83 to see Mark Twain's River for the very first time. So we were in the Twin Cities. We took him across the Mississippi on 2 or 3 occasions for him to observe the ebb and flow. And this was Twain's River, and he was called the Mark Twain of filmmakers. Now, in the 40s, Capra directed Spencer Tracy and Katharine Hepburn in a film called State of the Union. Now the photo you see on the screen is Spencer Tracy and Ernest Hemingway, because Spencer Tracy made a film of Ernest Hemingway's short story, The Old Man and the Sea. And I don't know if there are any particular fans of Ernest Hemingway here, but this is an interesting story that's in the book that Frank Capra told us. He said he did not believe it himself, but Spencer Tracy told it to him firsthand. He said, Spence was filming Hemingway's short story, The Old Man and the Sea, down in the Caribbean, when Hemingway invited him in for a drink in a little cantina. They were getting along well when suddenly, for no reason at all, Hemingway got up, turned around, and slammed his fist into the face of a waiter carrying a tray of food. The waiter went sliding across the floor as Hemingway sat down and continued the conversation as if nothing had happened. Spencer was in a state of shock and asked why he had done that. Hemingway said that he hit one of them every day just to show them who was boss. Spence said, "Would you like to try that on me?" Hemingway told him that he didn't hit any of his friends, whereupon Spence said, "I'm no friend," and he got up and left. So, kudos to Spencer Tracy, right? Milwaukee's own Spencer Tracy, I should add. This gentleman is still with us, and we've become friends through the years. And this was a picture of him at Paramount Studios with a beard just before he shaved his beard to play in his final season as Fonzie in Happy Days. And that's Henry Winkler. And I mentioned I worked for the Convention and Visitors Bureau for 7 years. Well, one of my pet projects that I had a lot of fun with was the dedication of this bronze Fonz statue with Henry Winkler that was dedicated on the river in Milwaukee downtown in 2008. And so Henry and I stay in touch. This was the morning after the dedication. We went back to the statue for some photos, and I always enjoyed working with Henry Winkler. This person is 95, I believe, and probably one of the great comedy filmmakers of the last 50, 60 years. He was married to Anne Bancroft, and he's always on. You know, you've heard in the interview that some comedians are dead serious. I'll talk more about him when I present my comedian's presentation. But some of them are always on, like Milton Berle, like George Burns, like this man, Mel Brooks. And he's known for The Producers in the late 60s, which became a huge Broadway show as well. Blazing Saddles, which is what they call today politically incorrect. A film that some people say you could not make today. Young Frankenstein, and then in the 1960s, he co-created a popular show that was on the spy spoof show with Don Adams called Get Smart. She's also still with us, and anyone know who that is? She won one Academy Award, and it's Shirley Jones. And this was taken in Shirley's living room about in the 1990s. And Shirley Jones made her film debut in Rodgers and Hammerstein's movie Oklahoma. She played the lead female role opposite Gordon McRae. She also worked with Gordon McRae in another Rodgers and Hammerstein film called Carousel. Excuse me. And in the early 60s starred in a great classic musical, talk about Americana, with Robert Preston, The Music Man. But along the way, in 1959, she took a big detour from those musical films and co-starred with Burt Lancaster in a film called Elmer Gantry, certainly not a musical. And in it, she played a prostitute and took home an Academy Award for Best Supporting Actress in that film called Elmer Gantry. But by the mid to late 60s, musicals were pretty much out of favor. They weren't making much money. They weren't making many musicals. They made a few. So she was not finding that kind of work anymore. Her sort of day in musicals came and went. And she was also raising some young children. So she told us that that's why she accepted the part as the matriarch of the Partridge Family in a popular TV series in the late 60s and early 70s called The Partridge Family, about a fictional family of singers band on the road. So that's Shirley Jones. Everyone knows who this is, one of the great characters of film history. People forget that Mickey Rooney in the late 30s was the biggest star in the world. He was #1 box office. He has had more ups and downs during his career. He's made millions, he's lost millions. He's had 8 wives, too. And the thing I always bring up, and it's in a different presentation, but there's another gentleman in the book, Hollywood Heyday, that equaled or tied Mickey in wives. And that's Artie Shaw. Remember band leader Artie Shaw? He also had 8 wives. And between the 8 wives of Mickey and the 8 wives of Artie, they actually shared one, I believe. That would have been Ava Gardner. They were not at the same time, I don't think, but they had one. But then, of course, Artie Shaw was also married to Lana Turner as well. So Mickey was quite the ladies' man at about 4'11", 5 feet. But he was also, as you can imagine during the interview, extremely high energy. And Mickey Rooney could pretty much do it all. He could do drama, he could sing, he could dance, he could do comedy. He was a really versatile, high-energy entertainer. In the book, Robert Wagner talks about Mickey Rooney. The thing about Mickey Rooney is, when you interviewed him, as we did in this hotel in Los Angeles, you didn't know if Mickey was telling you that, like making up stuff. It's like he was fabricating, embellishing, whatever you want to call it. But this is a funny story that Robert Wagner told us. He said, Mickey was an interesting guy. He was involved with some very beautiful ladies. He cut a swath. You know the great story about Mickey Rooney with Norma Shear, don't you? He had an affair with her. Now you remember Norma Shear was married to Irving Thalberg in the 1930s and was a big star at MGM. And so she was a player, and he said Mickey was going down on her in her dressing room when he said, "How do you like that? Andy Hardy going down on Marie Antoinette," because she played Marie Antoinette, and he was, of course, Andy Hardy. And he said, Robert Wagner, Mickey, he'd say anything to anybody, and he said he was totally certifiable. But, as I mentioned, Mickey lived to be 94, he passed away at 14. The sad ending for Mickey's life is that his last wife and his kids fought over his estate, and for a gentleman who made many, many, many millions of dollars during the course of his lifetime, when he passed away, he left an estate valued at just $20,000. So someone somehow went through all of his millions. But in the late 30s, you remember the great, huge successes in films like Boys Town, Captain's Courageous. I mentioned those Andy Hardy films in which he started to work quite extensively with Judy Garland. They became very close together, personally, professionally. Then he co-starred with Elizabeth Taylor in National Velvet. He had sort of a goofy role in the early 60s in Breakfast at Tiffany's, but late in life, he was also in a film, a very good dramatic role, in a film called The Black Stallion. And then he also was resurrected on Broadway in a show called Sugar Babies with Ann Miller, another alumni from MGM. And it, again, was this high-energy, almost burlesque kind of show, but it ran for several years, and Mickey, again, was top of the world for that period of time during the 1980s. Anyone recognize this gentleman? Yeah, great, Buddy Ebsen. So, the Buddy Ebsen was 2008 to 2003. You may not know this, some people do, but Buddy Ebsen almost was this close to film immortality because he was the original Tin Man in The Wizard of Oz. And what happened is when they started filming and they used an aluminum oxide, almost a spray paint, as part of his costume, the aluminum oxide went into his lungs and nearly killed him. And he was hospitalized in an iron lung for at least a month, and they could not hold up production. They had to keep going. It was too expensive. So they recast his part with Jack Haley, who ended up playing the Tin Man. They changed the formulation of the costume so that would not happen again. And so poor Buddy Ebsen missed out on that immortality by that much. Now, I mentioned that Hollywood is incestuous because I started talking about That's Entertainment, the film, in 1974. That was written and directed by the son of the Tin Man, Jack Haley Jr. Now, Jack Haley Jr. also at one point was married to Liza Minnelli. So if you look at it this way, I try to think the son of the Tin Man was married to Dorothy's daughter in real life. Think about it. But Buddy Ebsen, don't feel badly for Buddy. I mean, he didn't get Wizard of Oz, but he was great in Breakfast at Tiffany's in a dramatic role. In the 1950s, he was in a TV show for Disney called Davy Crockett. But he had massive success. I mean, tens of millions of people watched every week on CBS during the 1960s. Another goofy show, but it was the Beverly Hillbillies. I guess they were simpler times, right? Then he had another hugely successful show, a spy, private eye show in the 70s called Barnaby Jones. So Buddy Ebsen ended up having a very fine career on his own. This one is a real difficult one. This was taken when we had breakfast with him during college at a restaurant in Malibu. And of course, he looks a little different than, you might remember him in this. And he used to put light bulbs in his mouth as Uncle Fester in the Addams Family. But it's hard to believe that in the center, this adorable little child from 1920 became this. I guess we all grew up, right? Yeah. So Jackie Coogan was his name. Jackie Coogan, parents were involved. His father was in vaudeville. He was performing in stage in Los Angeles in about 1917. And who should catch him but the biggest star in the world, Charlie Chaplin. I mean, when you look at Hollywood stars throughout the last 100 years, there are probably very few that can compete in stature with Charlie Chaplin. But he was cast as this adorable child in the film called The Kid in 1920. And Jackie told us that working with Chaplin was an extremely positive experience. Chaplin was a very thoughtful comic genius. He would take weeks to develop a scene. He would not rush anything, and Jackie said he was always extremely kind and patient with him as a very young child actor. Now, Jackie Coogan continued to be a child actor in the 1920s. In 1938, Congress passed something called the Coogan Act. And what that was is that Jackie Coogan's parents spent all of Jackie's childhood earnings, millions of dollars. And so the Coogan Act that Congress passed in 1938 was meant to protect the earnings of child actors so that that would never happen again. Now, Jackie Coogan also married in the late 30s someone that you would say, gosh, that's quite a catch for Jackie. And that's that picture up. Does anyone recognize who his bride was in that photo? She became the nut, what?
Betty Grable.
Betty Grable. Wow, you are a film buff. Betty Grable became the #1 pinup, right, in World War II. And then was married for a long time to the band leader Harry James, the trumpeter. But she was, at one point, Mrs. Jackie Coogan. And then in the 1960s, Jackie was probably best known for that goofy character he played, Uncle Fester in the Addams Family. That's just a snapshot of a handful of them. Now, I'm one of these pack rats. I don't throw much away. So when I was going through my stuff, I looked and I found this is the first hotel in 1978 in Los Angeles that Tom and I stayed at. It's still there. It's the Beverly Terrace. If you can see this was at 6/17/78. So what are we, like literally, what's today, the 17th? Is today the 17th?
Yeah.
Wow. So this is 43 years ago. 43 years ago to this date, the room rate was $26. Plus, look at Los Angeles, $1.56 in tax. Now, that hotel today, because I checked a few years ago, was $250 a night at least. And I hope they cleaned it up a little bit since then. But anyways, we would stay there. This place called the Beverly Laurel is still there. It had weekly rates in a kitchenette, because Tom and I were college students. We couldn't afford to go out all the time. We would go to the local store and bring stuff into this hotel room just to do things on the cheap. So those are the kind of places we stayed at during our college years in Los Angeles. Now, these were more than just one-and-done visits. And in many cases, we went to some of these stars' homes more than once, Gene Kelly, Artie Shaw, others. But we also had Christmas cards for over 20 years that we received every year from people like Gene Kelly and George Burns. This is an example. It says Merry Christmas and Happy New Year, the Kellys. This is another front of one of their Christmas cards with Gene and his younger kids at this time, and a ferocious-looking dog. And then this one was one of that home I started with telling you about at the beginning. Because in the late 80s, his home that they bought in the 40s had a Christmas tree fire and burned to the ground. And his son, Tim, was able to get them all out safely from that fire. Now, somehow, some way, they managed to keep they had the blueprints. So the home was actually rebuilt to spec, to the original spec, and that particular card said, back in the house in time for Christmas, so after a year or two after that fire. Now this picture on the screen, I mentioned that most of them were done in the late 70s, 80s, and in the 90s, most of the interviews. And what I have on the screen are people that we captured or interviewed within the last, I would say, 8 years. They're all in Hollywood heyday. On the top is the wonderful comedian Don Rickles. In the center is still with us. I always call him the tan man. He's the always tan, George Hamilton. On the right, does anyone recognize him? We had the last interview that he ever gave at his home in Los Angeles. This was just a few years ago. His name was Mike Connors. And Mike Connors starred in a very popular show on CBS called Mannix. And he owned that show, and it's in another presentation. He gave credit to Lucille Ball because it was a Desilu production, and she fought for Mike Connors in that show. This gentleman, when we interviewed him a few years ago, and he passed away since then, was what you would call, he said he was forgotten, and he was a bitter comedian. But if you remember in the 1960s and 70s, he was almost a household name. His name was Jack Carter. And he was always on the Dean Martin roasts and all sorts of TV shows. And he was in Las Vegas, very popular in the 60s, 70s. But again, when we interviewed him, very bitter because he had been forgotten. He said, that the tour buses come by the home and say, this is where Joey Bishop lived next door, but they would never mention that Jack Carter was still in the house. The last photo, we're getting more current because it's a selfie. And who would take a selfie if we're not up to modern times? This gentleman who passed away about 2 years ago was a 4-time Oscar-winning music arranger, composer. He was a child protege at MGM in 1948, right out of high school. He was actually born in Berlin, but moved here in the 1930s with his family to Los Angeles. His name was Andre Previn. So that's just a snapshot of a few of the more recent ones. Now, I started with that showstopper with Astaire and Kelly, and before I take questions and wrap it up, I'd like one more clip, and this goes back to that iconic musical from 1952, Singing in the Rain, one of the great tap dances ever put on film with Gene Kelly and Donald O'Connor to a fun number called Moses Supposes. And there's a later picture of Gene with Donald O'Connor many, many years after they worked together in Singing in the Rain.
Chester chooses chestnuts. Cheddar cheese with chewy chives. He chews them and he chooses them. He chooses them and he chews them. Those chestnuts, cheddar cheese and chives in cheery, charming chunks.
Wonderful. Do another one.
Oh, thank you. Moses supposes his toes are roses. But Moses supposes erroneously. Moses, he knows his toes are roses. As Moses supposes his toes to be.
Moses supposes his toes are roses, but Moses supposes erroneously.
But Moses, he knows his toes aren't roses, as Moses supposes his toes to be. Moses supposes his toes are roses, but Moses supposes erroneously. A Mose is a Mose, a rose is a rose, a toes is a toes. Hoop-de-doodle-doo. Moses supposes his toes are roses, but Moses supposes erroneously. For Moses, he knows his toes aren't roses, as Moses supposes his toes to be. Moses, 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 Moses to be. Roses, 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 Moses, Moses, Moses. Couldn't be a lily or a tacky, happy dilly. It's gotta be a rose, cause it rhymes with gold. Moses, Moses, Moses.
So I believe that's it. Yeah, that is it. So I want to thank you all. Now, I believe I'll come back next month, and I thought this was a good one to sort of introduce what I've been doing for all these years. And then in subsequent presentations, I sort of hone in on different aspects. For example, I believe the next one is on the classic comedians. So we tell stories about Lucy and Bob Hope and George Burns and Milton Berle and things like that. We cover the Hollywood blacklist in a presentation and different things like that. But I thought, again, this is a good introductory one, and I look forward to seeing you all, I think, later next month. And is there any questions or comments? I'm happy to take any at this time.
I just wanted to say that when the Wilson Center started out in Brookfield, not many years later, Mickey Rooney came for there was a movie, and he came afterwards to do something on stage. And he got to talking and going on, and they finally, after hours, they had to pull him off stage.
Yeah, give him the hook.
He wouldn't get off the stage.
Yeah, that's something. And we don't know if anything he said was true, right?
Yeah, that's right.
But he was entertaining. Yeah. High energy, always. Yes?
What was your best and worst interview?
Well, there's not the, worst is always, best. Astaire and Kelly were not necessarily the best, but they were the most meaningful for, reasons I discussed. But if you look at, best, the Lucy one, I think, was very insightful because she was very serious. I'll talk about that next time. I mentioned Rod Steiger. It was very in-depth. It was very thoughtful. And that was a very interesting one. I think even Bob Hope, we managed to get him to talk a little bit more about personal issues that you would typically hear from Bob Hope, maybe because we were college students. I'm trying to think, there wasn't any...
Maybe the hardest.
The hardest one, or the most difficult, was a gentleman named Stanley Donen. And Stanley Donen is a director. And Stanley Donen, we first met him in Los Angeles at his home. At the time, he was married to an actress that's still with us named Yvette Mimieux. Remember that name? And Stanley Donen started in Broadway and was a protege of Gene Kelly's. Gene Kelly brought him up to Hollywood and gave him, they co-directed 3 films together. On the Town, which is the famous movie, Singing in the Rain, was Stanley Donen and Gene Kelly. And then a film called It's Always Fair Weather. But then Stanley went out on his own and has an incredible resume because his first solo film was Royal Wedding with Fred Astaire. You remember in one of the great musicals he did, Seven Brides for Seven Brothers, 2 for the Road with Audrey Hepburn, Funny Face with Audrey Hepburn, a great film with Cary Grant and Audrey Hepburn called Charade, a movie called Indiscreet. So he had a wonderful career, but yet he was very defensive, very difficult, and I think there was always a lot of friction between, him and Kelly. It was a great working relationship, but it had its friction. In fact, Stanley was married to a woman, a dance assistant named Jean Coyne. They got divorced, and in 1957, Gene Kelly married her. So you don't know what behind the scenes was going on there. But when you ask certain questions to Stanley, he could be a little short and with you. But then, 35 years later, Stanley was living in New York City, just like 5-6 years ago. And we went back and had a second visit, and fortunately didn't remember us. But he was, he mellowed. He was at the time almost 90 years old, and had mellowed considerably. And his girlfriend, until he passed away, was a woman named Elaine May. You may have heard of Nichols and May. That was his last significant other. So he was probably the most difficult of all the people, but not, again, a household name. The people from that era are different than the people today because doing interviews, first of all, at that time, we had youth on our side, and they liked the idea that they could talk to young people who could tell their stories to other young people. They liked that, and they were also came up in the studio system. The studio system was much different in that you had to be accessible to the media, you had to be fan-friendly, and you had to do your job. Today's stars are totally different than that. It's just a different environment. So they were all very welcoming, I would say. I don't have any dirt. I'd give it if I did, because, yeah.
A number of years ago, we saw Robert Osborne at Ken Chimney's,
Yeah.
and he was on the stage for 90 minutes, no notes, and he's talking about one star after the other that he knew and met, and people would ask questions, and he knew everybody. It was just a wonderful interview to watch it.
Yeah, and Robert Osborne, who was the first host of TCM until he passed away a few years ago. I don't think, and I think a lot of film buffs think that TCM hasn't been the same since he's gone. Because he had a passion and a love and a knowledge that you could tell when he was on that cable network and introducing those movies. He was replaced by a younger guy named Ben Mankiewicz. And Ben Mankiewicz doesn't have anywhere near that kind. In fact, Ben Mankiewicz got the job because he was auditioning, he was out of work, and took the first job he could get, which was hosting TCM.
Yeah.
He doesn't have that depth of knowledge that Robert Osborne knew. And actually, Robert and I was trying to get to him in New York the last time we were there, 5-6 years ago. Now, his health was already not very good. And I do have an email exchange from him, but we never got to meet him. Something that I regret because I've heard nothing but positive things. And one of his mentors was Lucille Ball. And he started out in front of the camera.
Yeah.
And I mentioned Beverly Hillbillies. He's a guest star. I remember watching it, and he's in a Beverly Hillbillies.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Yes?
You mentioned a book that you wrote.
Yes.
What is the title?
Hollywood Heyday. 75 candid interviews with Golden Age legends.
Did you interview Spencer Tracy?
No, because he died in 68. So I was 9 then. So. And yeah, he died about a month after wrapping Guess Who's Coming to Dinner. And I'm always upset at his hometown here that there's absolutely no recognition anywhere in the city, no plaque, nothing for Spencer Tracy. Yeah.
That's amazing.
Yeah, and it's you go to Waukegan, Illinois. There's Jack Benny Middle School. There's his home with a plaque. There's a statue. Jack Benny gets all this recognition in Waukegan, and we have nothing for Spencer Tracy here in Milwaukee.
Are you going to be talking about Charlton Heston?
Yeah. Charlton Heston comes up. I do a silver screen legend. So he comes up with Ernest Borgnine and Steiger and Gregory Peck. They're all in together in a presentation.
I'm from Two Rivers, and I know him.
Oh, yeah, his wife was from Two Rivers.
Yes.
Lydia.
Yes.
Yeah. And he was from, he went to New Trier down in Wilmette. And they used to come up to Two Rivers, right?
All the time.
Yeah, because
not all the time, but yes.
Yeah. And that was quite
I was with them when he was filming Ben-Hur in Rome.
Wow.
And I've had my picture taken in Ben-Hur's
The Chariot?
chariot.
Wow, that's a keepsake.
Out the horse.
No, that's good enough. That's pretty cool. That's a great story. And Charlton Heston, very much like I said, was the old school, like Gregory Peck. I mean, he had us in his home twice. That's pretty special. Anything else? Well, if not, I'll let you go. Well, it's not happy hour, but you can make your own happy hour. And I will see you all next month. So thank you all.